ואנחנו נעבור לחלק הבא שלנו, ואנחנו שוב נראה את הזיקה בין הנושא שכרגע שמענו עליו לבין שני הנושאים הבאים, ונשמע את הרצאתה של דוקטור לוצ'יה קרמינטי. אני אעבור לאנגלית לכבודה. Dr. Carminati was graduated from the University of Arizona in modern Middle East history in 2018 and is now a postdoctoral research fellow at the Polonsky Academy for Advanced Study of the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem. In 2020, she will begin her position as assistant professor in modern Middle East history at Texas Tech University, and of course we wish her success. She is at present finalizing a manuscript on the social and cultural history of Port Said and the Suez Canal in the second half of the 19th century, and her presentation, A Universal Meeting Point on the Isthmus of Suez, 1859-1869, the role of migrant labor in the making of the canal, will center on the Egyptian and foreign laborers who set off for the canal excavation works. She discusses in her paper the company's reliance on forced labor, the contingent mechanization of the Suez works, and the recruitment of workers in locations near and far. Dr. Carminati, please, the floor is yours.
So, thanks everyone. Thanks for this kind introduction. I'm very honored to be here, to have been invited to give this talk and to share with you some of the research insights I've been working on for the past year or so, which I'm hoping to turn into a book manuscript. I'm also very happy to share this stage with so many renowned scholars, and I want to especially thank Dr. Piquet and Dr. Barak for providing a much needed groundwork for my own work. So my presentation today deals specifically with the role of migrant labor in the making of the Suez Canal, which I'm going to quickly show you on a map here, which was produced in 1861. So the chronological focus of my presentation today is rather short, but I will still touch upon a number of different issues, including the forced labor in the canal work sites, the relationship between labor and mechanization, the international recruitment of labor, and finally, the strategies adopted by workers themselves in their everyday life in the work sites. So, on Easter Sunday of April 25 of 1859, the first pickaxe blow hit the ground of the northern Egyptian shore that ought to be parted going southwards in order to unite the Mediterranean and the Red Seas, a millennia-old dream. On that spring day, 150 Egyptian, Greek, Austrian, Italian, French, and Maltese workers had gathered on a point of the Mediterranean shore of Egypt east of the port city of Damietta, or Dumyat. They were supposed to dig according to plans that a recently established private company, universally named but French in substance, as Professor Shamir has reminded us, they were supposed to dig according to the plans that this company had negotiated with the Egyptian state. When the workers first began to labor the land to be parted in 1859, not only was the Suez Canal initiated, but the coastal city of Port Said also saw the light in the guise of the first of the canal's work sites and its northernmost harbor. By April 6, 1860, and I'm going to show you another map here, so 1 year later, 10 functioning encampments dotted the trace of the canal to be. First, up north, which you see on your left here, there was Port Said. Proceeding southwards, one would encounter Qantara, Al-Firdan, Bir Abdullah, Timsa, which would later be renamed Ismailia in 1862, Al-Fawar, Al-Murra, Tossum, Serapeum, and Jabal Janifa. In the following years, even more work sites would emerge at, for example, Ras el-Aish, Al-Gisr, and Shalouf, which are shown in this map here. As my other research shows, which unfortunately I'm not going to be able to present today, even before the 1860s came to a close, the network of campsites and budding towns all along the canal length offered a number of employment opportunities in fields other than rigidly defined canal work to both men and women, so both male and female migrants. But within the constraints of today's presentation, I will strictly sort of concentrate on those workers who toiled in the canal project proper. The scholarship on the history of the Suez Canal and its region is generally marked by a strong focus on technology, business, and architecture. And the groundbreaking contributions on which my own work builds mostly privilege the views of technicians and the officials involved in the enterprise, and they emphasize the technological and entrepreneurial challenges faced by the company and the ways in which it overcame them. So these studies do acknowledge that the canal cities, the new canal cities, brought multiple actors together in the city building process. But what about the lived experience of the migrant laborers moving to and residing and resettling in the canal's burgeoning towns? I'm approaching these places from the standpoint of their inhabitants, and not as if they had been emptied of all the people and filled in with the aspirations and dreams of town planners and their patrons. So, at least theoretically, who was supposed to actually perform the physical work needed to pierce the Isthmus of Suez? According to the concession stipulated in 1856 by the Suez Canal Company and the Egyptian government, 4/5 of the labor force employed by the company were to be made up of Egyptian workers. Later that year, on July 20, 1856, the so-called Decree and Regulation for the Felah workers, so Felah meaning cultivator, farmer, peasant in Arabic, these regulations specified that the Egyptian government committed to provide the workers, pay them a minimum salary every day, and feed them. Workers under 12 years of age would also be employed. They would get less than half of what adults made, but full food rations nonetheless. These stipulations were in part dictated by the company's desire to facilitate its search for manpower, hardly enticed by desert prospects. Partly, they were designed to save the company the hassle associated with hiring free workers, the costs of hiring free workers. Finally, they were aimed to assuage Egyptian concerns about the influx of a numerous European population into the country, into Egypt. Incidentally, however, through its initial promise of securing the necessary manpower, I also want to point out that the Egyptian government also strove to maintain a certain leverage towards the company. So, for example, in 1863, a few years later, after the first concession was signed in 1856, Egyptian officials tried to use Egyptian labor as a lever to get back the lands they had initially conceded to the company and that the now ruler, Ismail, wanted out of the company's hands. So the clauses clarifying that the 4/5 quota of labor force and the Egyptian government's commitment to provide such labor force did not actually specify the practical ways in which these labor force would be obtained. First of all, what had been put down on paper would soon be disputed. The Ottoman government perceived these transactions as violations of its sovereignty over the Egyptian territory, which was autonomous, but indeed still part of the Ottoman Empire, at least nominally. The Ottoman Sultan invited the Egyptian ruler to stop the works right away and to wait for an imperial order, a firman. According to the Ottoman government, in fact, the works that had been undertaken were no simple preparatory surveys. Rather, they were deemed of much more compromising nature. Therefore, on June 9 of 1859, the Egyptian government issued a proclamation forbidding its own citizens to participate to the project. Nonetheless, a few months later, 30 so-called Arab workers could be reportedly found laboring in Port Said, and they had been recruited in nearby Damietta, with no apparent opposition from the governor. Other similar engagements had taken place in Cairo at around the same time. Later that month, in fact, individuals who spoke Arabic and knew local customs, this was from, I'm quoting from the source, were dispatched throughout the Delta to recruit other peasant workers. So outwardly, both the Egyptian government and the Canal Company portrayed these workers as mere volunteers in the face of Ottoman and British accusations, because the British actually took a stance against the issue of forced labor in Egypt. But it's disputed whether this was more of a diplomatic, whether this was a diplomatic or humanitarian move. Actually, the works for the canal went ahead, and this compromising excavation work actually ended up necessitating thousands of laborers. According to company representatives, in fact, the recruitment service that was in place yielded scarcely satisfying results. So in January 1862, an official system of corvée, or forced labor, in the canal's work sites was established. First, a representative of the Egyptian ruler and later a governor of the Isthmus saw to it that the numbers of workers were sufficient and remained stable. So the first contingents of 20,000 men overall reached the Isthmus in February 1862. They hailed from a number of different locales, both from Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Some of these men are captured in this rare pre-1869 photograph of the excavation. But forced labor had been theoretically abolished throughout the Ottoman Empire decades before. Therefore, the Ottoman center of power was in no position to sanction forced labor in Egypt. So Istanbul blamed the Egyptian administration for forcing 2,000 men every month to abandon their jobs and their families to work on the canal. And the Ottoman power also took issues with the fact that these men were obliged to return home at their own expenses, and then that most of them had to travel great lengths in order to do so. At this point, though, not only was the Ottoman ruler hostile to the scheme of forced labor in the canal work sites, but the new Egyptian ruler, Ismail, whom I've mentioned before, who had succeeded the previous ruler, Said, in January 1863, was also contrary to forced labor. So on the one hand, forced labor represented a breach in Ottoman sovereignty. But on the other hand, it also drained the agricultural manpower that Egypt especially needed to cultivate cotton during the boom years of the American Civil War, something we've already heard about this morning. After 2 years, in 1864, the system of forced labor for the Suez Canal work sites actually came to an end, after the Egyptian government and the company, the Suez Canal Company, had submitted their differences to the theoretically impartial arbitration of the French emperor, and for which the Egyptian government paid very dearly. So the suppression of forced labor on the Suez work sites after 2 years of existence deprived the company of thousands of cheap laborers. It also prompted the company to import machines to get the work done. The so-called indemnity disbursed by Egypt for the end of forced labor actually helped pay for the elaborate dredging equipment that the company brought to the Isthmus, from France as well as the Netherlands and even from Scotland, for example. Without this machinery, the canal would not have been completed. Most contemporary actors and observers agreed that mechanization, after the departure of forced workers, was the only feasible way to continue the enterprise. The company founder, Ferdinand de Lesseps, reluctantly perhaps, was actually pushed to think of original ways in which he could substitute machines for men. From 1862 to 1864, when it could still rely on forced labor, the company actually maintained a very ambiguous relationship between its willingness to mechanize and its reliance on manual work. So early on, company officials were aware that they could not count on indigenous forces in the long run, and hypothesized that they would have to find mechanical substitutes for workers. They experimented means capable of replacing the workers with machines. But even when the reduction of the contingents of forced workers was looming near, Delessé, so the company founder himself, still insisted on the company's right to rely on the stipulated conventions and tap into the reservoir of free Egyptian labor in order to ensure the prompt achievement of the enterprise. So it was the end of forced labor, therefore, that prompted a process of forced mechanization. And this dismisses the notion that the company, in its self-ascribed civilizing mission in Egypt, bestowed scientific and technological progress to non-Western and technologically inexperienced peoples. Secondly, the idea that it was the end of forced labor that actually prompted forced mechanization also deflates the claim that workers' numbers were reduced as a consequence to the introduction of machines. Rather, it was the insufficiency of man labor that spurred the use of new technology. Problems with fluctuating numbers of workers had already occurred before. But the definitive withdrawal of forced labor posed a new set of challenges, such as, for instance, have the cost of hired workers skyrocket. Not only was a heavier reliance on machinery not undertaken lightly, but it did not solve all the technical difficulties that the company was facing. First of all, the employment of machines on a large scale, albeit a necessity, was also a seriously costly operation. Secondly, machines, among others, had to be put together after they had reached Port Said, so the northernmost harbor of the canal area, after these machines had reached Port Said in pieces. Dredging machines, of which we see an example here, could operate only after workers had cut the soil to water level and carried the earth away from the furrow they had traced. The maneuvering techniques of the crews operating the dredgers, moreover, remained important for the correct functioning. Finally, even if machinery did the work of a large number of workers, it still proved to be insufficient and had to be repaired. Dredgers, with their round-the-clock drudgery to keep the intruding desert sands from blocking the canal, became a very apt representation of the enterprise's technological triumph and indeed fascinated many travelers until they figured conspicuously in the iconography that was produced out of Suez. But the subjugation of nature did not proceed without accidents. All in all, the need for workers remained uneven. It varied according to the local terrain, according to local circumstances. The basin for repairs in Suez, for example, necessitated more machines than men, while the excavation of the canal itself needed men to prepare its embanking. So the system of forced labor on the canal work sites did not last long, from 1862 to 1864, but it lasted enough to bring thousands of Egyptians, from other parts of Egypt to this strip of land, where many eventually settled. Moreover, its demise also meant that the company had to intensify its efforts to recruit workers locally and internationally. Attracting workers to this part of Egypt was perhaps a titanic effort. The Isthmus was described as so hot that the sun alone could cook an egg or get rid of fleas if one's shirt was laid out on the sand. Nonetheless, timidly at first, workers did show up. Word traveled across Europe that there was good money to be earned on the canal works. In the work sites, reportedly, according to a company source, each worker zealously pursued their assigned tasks. And I'm quoting, "Workers dig the sand along the furrow. Masons build houses. Carpenters and stonecutters and other workers pursue their tasks energetically. Women wash their laundry." So there were women. I'm not going to talk about them, but they were there. This place resembles a beehive where each holds on to his or her occupation. An end of quote. Reports that the labor force was abundant and content with work conditions must have reassured company shareholders and appeased skeptics. Nonetheless, months or even years on the Suez work sites did not always guarantee the economic security that migrants were yearning for. How little some of these workers owned is visible from the paper trails spun by their death and the auctioning of their belongings, when their life shrank to the contents of their pockets. The Austrian stonecutter, Andrea Iwich, for example, after succumbing to dysentery, left absolutely nothing, not even a passport or identity papers. Many did not even possess more than a change of clothes. The Dalmatian laborer, Jan Manovic, for instance, whose belongings we see listed here, left 2 stockings, 1 pair of shoes, 1 shirt, 1 pair of trousers, 1 jacket, 1 hat, and 1 leather belt, all were in very bad condition and estimated at a meager 50 cents of a franc. In contrast, the French subject, Joseph Carlot, surveillant of the works, left more than 800 francs worth of stuff. The heap of things he left behind included, among others, and bear with me, but I think this is interesting, glasses, candles, a sponge, some soap, files, scissors, a screwdriver, an ink pot, a magnifying glass, razors, a brush, a French-Arabic dictionary, a number of religiously devoted Catholic books, and a mosquito net. So individual misfortunes created snapshots of the belongings and resources in the life of different kinds of workers who helped build the canal, but they differentiated them in death as they did in life. Another source that I often and eagerly employ in my work are personal letters that are hardly ever inventoried as such in the archives. But these rare and precious archival finds allow a few glimpses into migrant laborers' own perspectives. Those who had resettled on the Isthmus actually described what they perceived as their isolation, the harshness of the surrounding environment, and their sacrifices. One man wrote to his father in 1862, "I find myself in a desert, far from everyone." A carpenter who had just been sacked penned the following: "I'm an honest man who's come to the desert with the intention of earning a piece of bread and not to enjoy himself." A Franciscan friar who witnessed migrants' hardships at the beginning of the canal's enterprise testified that they had to withstand a blazing sun, inflamed sands, poor shelters, and scarce water. Consider that while workers' initial intentions might have been to stay 1 year or 18 months at most, their residence on the Isthmus at times added up to several years. They were staying longer, and they were not making enough to return or satisfy their families' pressing requests. One man, for example, in his heart-wrenching letter, lamented that for 14 months he had not received any news and felt forsaken by his own family back in the Italian peninsula. In the opposite direction, one woman in Dalmatia, so what is now Croatia, wrote to her husband, who had departed for the Isthmus 16 months prior and was still not sending enough money. Her letter almost threatened him. "If you got it into your head that you want to come back, come, because the way is open, but think hard before you do so." And end of quote. In order to express their discomfort with their circumstances, workers, such as the ones who were diligently posing in this photograph, which ended up in the company's archives, could and did undertake a variety of very mundane actions, ranging from the intentional slowing down of the work pace, to the refusal of labor, to physical departure from the workplace. So it was not, as it has been suggested, just the workers, the skilled workers on dredgers who landed on the Isthmus well into the canal project who most frequently went on strike or rebelled. Those Egyptian forced workers who had been engaged in earthwork in the early 1860s could rely on a long-standing repertoire who had been tried out before in the government's public works. For example, in 1862, when the forced labor system was still in place, some of the Egyptian laborers deserted the work sites. Apparently, they resented the ill treatment at the hands of their French foremen. Alas, fugitives were led back, and the French supervisor was eventually found blameless. Other laborers in 1863 reportedly created pretexts for not working, so-called pretexts for not working, thus delaying the planned schedule of advancement of the project. Egyptian workers, whether they were fellah or not, were also reputed to be keen saboteurs. Ostensibly, whenever they found a stray wheelbarrow, tool, or beam, they broke it and hid it under the sand after checking that no one was watching. By 1865, after the end of forced labor and upon the intensification of international recruiting efforts, numerous desertions were recorded on all work sites. They were actually paralyzing the installations of entrepreneurs working for the canal company right at a time when they ought to be fulfilling the contracts they had signed with the company. Some of those who had been mainly recruited from abroad after the end of forced labor in 1864, such as Moroccans, Greeks, Dalmatians, and Bretons, resorted to strikes. From the company's viewpoint, they were ungrateful and unworthy. They could exercise a special leverage because their expenses had been covered, and they preferred, presumably so, to lead a miserable life in Egypt rather than honor their commitments. But good reasons to desert or resist, however, may have been rife. In 1865, cholera made its appearance in the work sites. On March 1st, 1866, about 100 workers went on strike, lamenting that the local store was lacking staples that they considered essential: cheese, lard, pasta, and potatoes. Others recriminated about the frequent cases of violent deaths, fatalities from wounds, and mutilations in the works. Finally, delays in the distribution of wages could also trigger strikes, which unfailingly prompted supervisors to demand that troublemakers be harshly reprimanded in order to avoid any later trouble. So the history of resisting labor on the company worksites shows that different groups of migrant workers resorted to similar tactics. In fact, they worked side by side. Between 1864 and 1869, for example, the yards established by the Douzeaux Frères in Port Said, for example, employed at least simultaneously 350 Egyptian, Italian, and Greek workers. So there is no explicit evidence of cooperation, but toiling in proximity to one another may have led to their joint refusal or pantomime of work. And even individual acts of desertion may have in fact depended on collective networks and organization. At the very least, there's some evidence that workers spoke, with sometimes bizarre outcomes, a common language that apparently resembled the so-called lingua franca employed by Mediterranean sailors, or the petit sabir, the international and barbarian idiom in use among French soldiers in Algeria that was peppered with the technical terms that were pervasive on the Suez work sites. So on the whole, the lack of essential goods, the fear of disease or death, thoughts of home may have all been valid motives to set out in haste from the work sites. Remuneration itself may not have been a sufficient incentive to stay, as in the case of a coppersmith called Junot, who in May 1866 left Port Said without collecting his pay or notifying which way he was going. Nothing else was known of him except that he was thought to have died near one of the canal work sites later that year. So to conclude, I want to recapitulate my main points about the late 19th century history of labor and history of migration in the canal region, of which the northernmost port city with its mixed population is portrayed in this photograph. So I've discussed some of the ways in which laborers were recruited and organized to work in the work sites throughout the Isthmus of Suez, both forcibly and voluntarily, both locally and internationally. I've presented some of the diplomatic disagreements that were engendered by the company's need for labor and workers' Isthmus-bound movements. Concurrently, I've explored, and this is something that my broader research strives to do, I've explored the lives and the circumstances of the migrants who had set out for the Suez works. Ultimately, I have underlined the unspoken importance of these migrant massive laborers for the success of the canal project and the attainment of regional power. So, a few of those who had relocated to the Isthmus remained nameless because they drowned in the canal and their corpse could not be identified, for example. Of others, like the man who's captured here, nothing remains but an anonymous keepsake portrait taken just before rushing to the docks in Marseille, lost on its way to or from Egypt, and stranded in the consular archives. So I try to abandon those metaphors that portray migrants as elements in some unthinking natural world, such as streams, flows, waves, transplants, uprooting. My research shows that by abandoning these metaphors and by focusing on these moving individuals, even if unidentified or anonymous or not important in the traditional way of conceiving history, but my research shows that these individuals still shaped the imperial strategies and the history of the Suez Canal region. I claim that the need for labor all along the canal in the making altered pre-existing circuits of circulation and mobility, but also formed new ones. And finally, my work highlights the often haphazard component of migration, the contingency of mobility, the restraints and the possibilities available to people on the move in the mid-19th century Mediterranean. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.